training was, like I was not a very athletic person in high school. So I was one of those people that sort of was not an athlete as I was growing up.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny how I ended up going to sports. I was actually really overweight. So I was like very overweight in high school and ended up, I played some sports when I was younger, like I played a lot of sports when I was young, but then probably after like intermediate, there wasn't too much. I got into eSports, which is kind of funny. So that was actually my first sport.
Well, wait, what's your eSport?
Well, I was playing Call of Duty back when Call of Duty, like it was like when if you're old enough to know Call of Duty games, like Call of Duty 4 was like the big game, like the first big game, and I ended up like playing. It was before landing got really big. This is just it's a weird tangent for a sports science podcast, but I was playing essentially like at an international level as like a 14-year-old.
Dude.
And competitions like overseas, and there was pretty decent prize money in some of the tournaments, and it was kind of crazy. Like in some ways, you look at that, and a lot of people don't see the relevance when it comes to something like playing a competitive video game with foot. But from a mental side of things, I actually learned a lot about like at the time I just didn't like losing and just wanted to win, and just can't really do sport 12 hours a day. We could probably play a game 12 hours a day. Anyways, so that was then. I got to sort of the end of high school and was unhappy with how I looked and felt, and then I got into training. Was essentially it. Dropped from maybe like 102 to 105 down to like 67 kilos.
That's huge.
So that was a change.
Yeah.
And I think like at that stage, I was someone who just liked to know how things worked. So it was kind of me getting into sports science was like just wanting to understand how things worked a little bit more and enjoying training.
Dude, have you thought about strength conditioning for esports? They hire full-time strength conditioning. There's colleges here in the States. They hire full-time strength conditioning coaches for their college esports teams, bro. There's money in there now.
I bet they're getting paid something decent as well.
Dude, especially with those big like professional teams, the ones that are like doing stupid prize money and have all the endorsements. It's kind of crazy,
but like it's funny when I was, like at those stages, even then I was like, it was when I started to formulate the ideas around like, well, if you feel good, you perform well. If that makes sense. So it was kind of like towards the end of it, it was when I was like, oh, I probably should, go and do some exercise or whatever. But I know it's like quite common for like race car drivers, but that's a little bit different. There's actually a lot of force that they have to, resist and deal with while being cognitively aware and while, when it comes to reaction times and whatnot. But yeah, it's an interesting world.
I remember reading a paper on esports. I think it was on, I don't know if it wasn't the whole paper on there, but there's a section in it about players who does physical appearance almost like intimidate you as a player. And I can't remember what they were doing, but basically, yes, like physical appearance could intimidate players. So if you're a bigger esports gamer, like you're playing Call of Duty against some massive jack dude, you're like, oh shit.
Yeah, I could see it. But yeah, that was such a like as a very different like entry point to sport, I think. And even then, like I really got into training, but it was like bodybuilding training when I started.
That's how we all start.
It's basically how we all start, and which was cool, And then I sort of wanted to get into a bit of powerlifting, which was okay too. I was never the most gifted person, but I was pretty persistent. And I guess like not being the most gifted, you're seeking more answers. If that makes sense, and to try to do things a bit better. And then I ended up from there getting a little bit bored when it came to like the monotony of some of the training, and then got into a bit of weightlifting. So nice. I enjoyed Olympic weightlifting.
Ooh, where did you train for Olympic weightlifting?
Well, when I say I trained for Olympic weightlifting, it wasn't like I was training to compete or anything. I was basically just, like putting time and effort into, the clean, jerk, and the snatch. There was a place in Hamilton. So I'm from Hamilton in New Zealand. And it was a place called Athlete's House, which you'd know Matt Kritz. So Matt Kritz was the head performance guy there. So he would sort of help, his like system was put in place within the gym. It was one of the first gyms that I worked at, actually. And it was there that I spent a lot of time sort of working on some of that stuff. It was a cool space, honestly.
Nice.
You don't really, for public, like gyms that are publicly available, you don't really get a lot that are targeted towards athletes.
Yeah. Because it doesn't make money.
Exactly. Unfortunately, people often think that sport makes money, but it's not. It's often not the case.
That's why we're on a podcast right now.
We do it because we love it, essentially. But I think it was through like the Olympic weightlifting that I, it was more so I just enjoyed like the movement side of it and the movement variability. And I had like previously historically had a few like back injuries and like little things, and it's sort of like I think the risk reward for trying to push super maximally when it came to a lot of like just standard strength, it didn't quite align with, I guess, what I wanted and what I was doing at the time. But I really enjoy the weightlifting still. But then as soon as I went into this martial arts gym, that was, all of a sudden those principles or ideas and, when it came to the movement stuff that I was enjoying, it was like all of that times 1,000. And I was like, fuck, like this is amazing. Trying to, dial down when it came to just technique and movement. And that was sort of, I guess, how it started. And it wasn't too long after that I started getting into the UFC. So probably around that 2015, 2016 mark. And yeah.
I love that.
It was funny. It was funny because when I was doing my sports science degree, I wasn't really invested in any sports 100%. I enjoyed science. I enjoyed understanding how things worked. I enjoyed like movement and training, but I didn't necessarily have a sport that I was attached to. And I didn't even watch a lot of sports that were on. Like even at this time, I was still working in different sports, but it was kind of like finding your Pokemon in some ways, when it came to like all of a sudden like
your gaming references.
Martial arts just clicked like that, and it was it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. I actually used to. So one of the guys, so a friend of mine, Jamie Vanderker, he passed away many years ago. He's on the mural there in the New City Kickboxing Gym.
Yes.
Up on the wall. And so we used to trade. I would teach him 45 minutes of Olympic weightlifting, and he would teach me 45 minutes of Muay Thai. And so we'd either go into the old City Kickboxing Gym and we'd do that, or he would just like come over to my garage or whatever. We'd just do it at home in the garage and stuff. And that's how like
nice.
I really got into like that stuff. I haven't done much since. I want to, but splitting time between grappling and striking, work, family, all that kind of stuff is crazy. So
it's funny, eh? If you don't have a lot of time, or you're not committed to fighting, as soon as you start splitting the martial arts, you're committing to being like very average for a very long period of time.
Unfortunately. Let's go straight into this. We've been talking about all sorts of stuff, and I want to.
Yes.
There's more questions I want to jump into. I mean, our first podcast we talked a lot about kind of like the testing going on and what you're doing with some of the guys at City Kickboxing. I want to go into more of the training philosophy you have. I guess I'm just going to say just training in general. And I want to start around. Let's start around what the videos I put out recently on Instagram and YouTube around the long duration isometrics. I talked to Angus about that just the other day.
Awesome.
That came out this week, and that was a really good chat on the kind of history of where it kind of came from, what he's doing. But I know you messaged me the other day about some of the results you're seeing potentially from it. I don't know how much you want to share about what you're kind of seeing there. You just kind of take it from there. And then we can maybe just go into as well, like how you're implementing them, where they fit within the training program, how all the nuts and bolts of essentially implementing these long duration isometrics.
Yeah, so it's something that we've played around with for like quite a while. I mean, like Angus has been using them since I've known them, and it's been, many years now. I guess like the evolution of them has probably changed in terms of like what we know and understand over time. Pretty much what I think a lot of people have thought of, I think there's like this idea that stretching and like range of motion itself is inherently bad for things like power and velocity. And when you like look at like the literature, that's not the case. I mean, there are some aspects that might become compromised in certain areas, but that's sort of one part of a full picture. And like a good example being like, even if you look at a lot of research studies that compare, different physical components of different tiered athletes, like a lot of the times, if they use something like a sit and reach test, you will see the athletes who perform better on neuromuscular tests and like speed-based tests end up, they do end up having, say, a better sit and reach than athletes that don't, which I think is like important to sort of preface that range of motion inherently like is not something that we should be afraid of. Like when we look at the long duration isometrics, like essentially what we're looking at is, just go back a little bit, when we look at things like speed or velocity based training, I think what we end up doing is we view it from this lens of the neuromuscular system, when it doesn't maybe it doesn't quite make sense because we can't produce as much force, or we can't produce a lot of force at all, or there's like velocity characteristics from a pure speed standpoint don't quite align. But when you sort of change the lens and you look at it more from like an architectural perspective, like that's when we start to potentially see some of the benefits of this in a different light, if that makes sense. So we use these, I use them for two different reasons. Like one of them is the architectural changes to the muscle, which I think is, Angus touched on it a bit in the podcast, is a potential method to, and we say potential because what we're looking at is fascicle length being like a pseudo for adding sarcomeres in series, which when you have more sarcomeres in series, the muscle contractile velocity is greater. When you look at actually like developing speed itself, like velocity is very hard to develop. Like it's not hard. It's very easy to get someone strong. It's not easy to get someone fast. And I think like that's probably something that you see often when it comes to like athletes or training. If you view speed purely from like a nervous system and muscular perspective, that's one potential element. When we like shift lenses, but it isn't the only element, right? And you can look at like muscle fiber composition as another potential way to increase like maximal contractile velocity in terms of having more fast twitch muscle. And we've talked about this a little bit. Perhaps having more 2x isn't necessarily the most beneficial for sports like MMA that have a endurance component as well. So then as we sort of like go down this lens, then we can look at architecture. And as soon as we look at architecture, it potentially provides another way to look at, what underpins velocity and how do we change it. So when we started using these, essentially we probably weren't doing them long enough. I know Gus touched on in terms of, making these quite uncomfortable. It seems like pushing them to a reasonably extreme standpoint is required to create some of these changes. For me, the way that I use them primarily is sometimes it might be maintenance through the week, or other times we'll use them maybe at the end of a session and sort of push the boat out. But I mean, these can really they're not, it's not a big strength exercise, like the nervous system taxation isn't the same as say on a heavy squat. So you can actually do these like reasonably frequently. But yeah, it's still early days in terms of like quantifying some of the changes. Observationally, I talked about the OC erg that we have in Cambridge, which gives us the ability to test essentially high speed power. So power on a power bike, it's run by a flywheel, and we can look at the different power that's produced across different RPM ranges. So we've seen some pretty interesting and positive shifts in that curve, potentially as a result of some of this training. And I can't say exclusively because, of course, there's many things that are happening at one time. Mm-hmm. So I definitely couldn't say exclusively, but it's definitely been a trend that has been pretty positive, which has been cool.
Interesting. So what's happening on this bike then in terms of, I guess, this positive trend? It's being able to produce more power at high velocities or more force at high velocities? Is that what you're seeing out of that?
Yeah, it's essentially more power, right? So like with the bike, what's unique about it is as the flywheel gets going, it gets very fast, like super maximally fast. And essentially your ability to still apply force in a very short period of time is how we have the ability to measure that, if that makes sense, versus if you were driving the crank or driving the bike purely manually like you would on a watt bike, which is, I think, like, it's quite interesting. And I think when you dive into the literature around like combat sport, force and velocity, you don't see a lot of studies that have explored combinations or striking sequences. Majority of research is based around like punches in isolation, single punches in isolation.
Punch. Yeah.
And that to me is interesting because it's definitely important. But I think, and I'm not sure how much you've seen around that. It seems like there's a lack of understanding when it comes to like the cyclic nature of punch sequences or just striking sequences.
I'll check out for you more than that. No, I'm with you.
Well,
I'm with you.
have you seen much around research when it comes to a lot of the combination
I've seen
work?
One paper that used one paper, I think it was, or two papers that have used combination. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones they were, but they used it, and they did rounds on the bag, and they just used, I think was it just the power strikes within that round as well, or they took the average. I can't remember exactly, but they basically set it up where it wasn't just one punch against whatever it was. It was multiple. It was rounds they used. Man, I have to dig up and see which one it was.
Yeah,
because,
I've seen.
I know it's been done, but
and you can tough. Like there's a few studies you can derive a little bit from, but it's not something that's been looked at specifically. And
no,
I think like
definitely not. It's more to see changes from some kind of intervention versus the actual thing itself.
Yeah, 100%. And I think when you like break down striking, of course, singular punches are, something that happens, like a jab, rear hands, like 1-2 to a certain extent. But I think, when it comes to putting strikes together, the cyclic nature of that is probably a little bit understated. So I think when you look at potentially the high-speed power on something like one of these bike tests, I think is something that potentially relates back to something that makes sense. Yeah. So, which to me is quite interesting and something that we're currently exploring a little bit.
Well, I guess the other thing to think about as well is with the one punch tests, how much of that really translates to live fighting.
100%.
Because you're never going to be in that position to be able to stand there, measure your target out, wind up, and just throw a huge bomb at at whatever it is, at whatever target you're trying to hit. Because there's so many other variables.
100%. I think even from like I know there's limited studies that have measured forces in competition, but I know the ones that have, there's one in particular I can think of substantially lower than what you see in any of the standalone tests, which is what you'd expect, right?
I need to link you up with Wes Elliott after this. He owns Strike Tech. He has some really cool.
I've got one.
I've got Strike Tech.
Yeah. I played around with it, but I haven't used it in any official capacities. I play around with all kinds of shit.
I'm gonna link you up ananyway because he's got some really cool data he's collected, and you guys will click.
Because he's doing some really cool stuff. Yeah, I've considered using it for because I wanted one of the things that I'd like to figure out is in terms of like combat specific performance testing. It's hard to really quantify external load. Be cool, like potentially something like that is an option.
He's doing something right. Actually, I probably shouldn't spill the beans. I'll tell you after.
Yeah, well, we can. Yeah.
He's doing some cool stuff. But with those long duration isometrics, could you theoretically or potentially replace that duration and volume with intensity and still get the similar adaptation? So instead of having to drag out 5-minute sets, 1-minute sets, but loaded?
So that's a good question. Honestly, like the answer probably is that we don't understand at the moment. I can tell you from a practical perspective, I do that. So I use like a combination of both, like weighted, less duration, unweighted, more duration. I do think that, getting to a point where you're struggling to maintain position, and, you're starting to get a few shakes happening, that's probably where where some of the magic happens. But in terms of which is better, yeah, that's pretty early days. I also like from like there's a connective tissue protective element to those that I really like as well, in terms of like taking the tissue to long muscle lengths and having to utilize the fascia, the connective tissue around the joint to stabilize. So I think there's a nice benefit to that as well. And I think that's probably how they've been used primarily in the past.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Mainly
guess
around tendon
yes,
stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
100%. But yeah, as soon as we start to take things out, what we get out of them is just a little bit different, I think.
Regarding, let's stick on the isometric topic. Have you played around or implemented oscillatory isometrics at all then, along with this approach?
Yes. So that's something that's something I played around with as well. I think like I like them as a variation, or you can do them in a way that is still very much along the lines of long duration, or potentially there's other ways you could do them that promote other variables like RFD or whatnot, which I like as well. I think like to be fair with like a lot of the stuff, we're still figuring out how things are best operated. I know Gus has probably spent a bit more time around interchanging like within the oscillatory versus not. For me at the moment, I like that as variation, and especially when it comes to trying to like, say athletes struggle when it comes to just general range. I like that as a way to push through some of those barriers.
Almost like a disadvantaged position oscillatory, like bottom position squat, kind of bouncing as a oscillatory iso.
I've done them a lot in the lunge positions. I quite like the lunge position, and I think if you're someone who's quite stiff, especially sort of anterior hip, I think something like adding some of the like oscillations can help when it comes to being able to get a little bit more range.
Wait, how are you doing them? Because there's two ways that I've seen that done. They're either done where, I guess you could say, Joel Smith, Dan Fichter style, where you're kind of tensing and then kind of dropping and rebounding back up, tensing, dropping back up.
Yes, totally. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Or there's just kind of the rapid bounce. That's kind of like Cal Dietz style.
Yes, totally. So I'm referring to more so the second, where you're sort of bouncing in and out of the in range position.
Yeah.
But the first option, it would be something that that potentially you could look at from like an RFD perspective, which I think is valuable as well. I think like with stuff like that, I mean, I think it's really important with any training methods to evaluate, where it fits into the sport and potentially the outcome that you want to get in the sport. In terms of some sporting positions, like that's probably more advantageous than others, if that makes sense. So I think it's the work with any of the stuff. It's important to sort of zoom out a little bit and think about, what's the context in terms of, one, the adaptation that I'm trying to drive, two, how it relates back to the sport specifically. And then as well as that it's, what within, a very complex wheel of modalities and methods that sort of interplay with everything else. I think we touched on it a bit last time. Like I know a lot of people get very like into, being like functional movement only or powerlifting only, or or whatever it is. The quote from Bruce Lee I thought was fantastic. Was essentially take what is useful and disregard what isn't, and the context is the sport and the person. And that's sort of how I like to look at a lot of that stuff.
Are you looking at stimulating the similar adaptations with the oscillatory isos versus the long duration, or is there something else you're looking at with those?
Yeah, I think like for the most part, yeah, like a lot of it still comes down to architecture and fascicle length. Potentially, like, yeah, that would be why I'd put them in, to be honest. Some of the times it's around trying to create some connective tissue adaptations as well, whether or not it's from a health or performance standpoint. But generally, that would be why I put them in.
Perfect. I guess if we're still on muscle architecture, we can talk pennation angle as well regarding, I guess, speed and power, since we've talked about muscle fascicle length. If we're talking decreasing pennation angle for improving speed and power, I'm assuming then like the general eccentric training and plyometrics you're doing is kind of geared towards, and if you're thinking muscle architecture,
yes,
alongside everything else, those would be the I guess the main modalities, or have you got some other things up your sleeve too?
Honestly, like I haven't put enough thought into trying to gear changes to pennation angle specifically. I know it will be the case, like with a lot of that type of training. And I do wonder, like in terms of, I mean, when you look at the relationship between pennation angle, velocity, pennation angle, strength, yeah, it's definitely something that I've looked into, but isn't something that I'm actively chasing at the moment, if that makes sense. I guess MMA is complex because you still need to be strong, but you need to be fast as well. So I guess that relationship is something that I am not confident enough to look at driving specifically, if that makes sense. What are your thoughts on it, James?
I think the same thing as you regarding you can't just go for that pure sprinter muscle architecture type with that really small pennation angle, because as you mentioned, you need that strength-based pennation angle because that's where you're able to, I'm going to say absorb, but I don't want to say it, but I can't think of a better word, absorb or deal with the eccentric forces that come with various activities. So it's almost like you have to have it. What's interesting within the research though, because I did a really big dive into it, and I was like, what actually causes this pennation angle to decrease for improving speed and power? And you see some pretty conflicting stuff regarding plyos and sprints and jumps. What I found interesting is when I dug a little deeper into some of the meta-analysis and things, they say, okay, plyometrics increase pennation angle, and you go, like, that doesn't make sense, because if we're talking speed, power, and a lot of the other interventions, we see this decrease in pennation angle. But when you dive into the research that was actually cited in the meta-analysis, they weren't using plyometrics. They were using like loaded jump squats to 90 degrees kind of thing. And you're like, huh. So that's more of a strength-based jump movement. Maybe that's why they didn't see a pennation angle. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting what's out there. I kind of had to do a really big deep dive just to really try and get my head around what was going on. That's the conclusions I pulled out of it, basically. Just kind of, okay, plyometric sprint style stuff and eccentric work is probably going to give you that more of a shallower pennation angle, and then obviously your main strength work is going to push it the other way. I guess, honestly, probably depending on how much you're doing of each, you're going to have a hybrid profile anyway, I guess, if you're training all of them. So probably not such a big driver.
I do wonder how it plays into when you think about full body coordination, like force coordination for things like striking. It's it's so complex, and I think we probably don't give enough credit to like the complexity of like the neuromuscular like coordination, synchronization that goes into bringing everything together to strike well and efficiently. And I do wonder, like, when it comes to things like pennation angle and it comes to the transfer of force for things like striking movements, what the potential implications are. And that's not something I can answer, and then I also wonder how that sort of links in with some of the like fascial elements as well. Because I think like when you look at the literature, I think there's definitely like a clear relationship between neuromuscular qualities and competition levels, which is cool. But when you also break it down, there's a very clear relationship between experience level, so time training, and those same qualities as well. So it's like it's pretty clear that athletes who have trained longer have like produced more force, whether it's impact force, like when it comes to striking as well. And observationally, when you look at especially like a lot of athletes in Thailand and things like that. You don't have to be the strongest guy to produce a lot of force when it comes to striking. So it probably highlights that, there's a lot we touched on the neuromuscular system that is undoubtedly important, but there's a lot that goes into effective striking that is separate to some of that as it pertains to purely strength and power.
No,
I think what's interesting. Sorry, you go, James.
Go.
What's interesting as well, like that is relationship. But when you when you start looking at studies that really separate higher competition levels, lower competition, like high competition levels and say high competition levels, like really the separating factor is velocity. So in terms of high level athletes, it's actually the same as Gus brought up when it came to sprinters and ground contact times, right? Essentially, athletes who are more elite produce similar forces, they just produce them quicker. And that's like reasonably clear through a lot of the research that's out, even within combat sports.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, even with like team sports, high-level rugby competitions are all, faster speeds, faster athletes, faster gameplay in general.
100%.
So it's across the board. And I actually want to go down this power road, but I want to switch the topic first. I want to get to this before I come back to that. And it'll be on conditioning. And obviously you have been working a lot within triathlon.
Cycling.
Is that right? Cycling, sorry. Cycling. And I guess endurance-based sports. So I want to know, okay, where do I want to start this? Let's start with the topic that always comes up and is always the question, and then I'll dive a little deeper into it. But Zone 2, high-intensity interval training, these two are almost seen as like two different entities that can never come together. It'll be interesting to kind of hear your perspective in terms of combat sports. Where do these things fit, or even do they fit? And then let's start there. Where do these things fit, and do they fit?
Hey, that's a really good question, honestly. I think if we touch on Zone 2 first, I think Zone 2 training inherently can be important, but it really depends on the context. So a good example being, and this is just an example, I think, for programming in general, is that within a system where an athlete does a lot of skill, a lot of drill-based work, and essentially they're working within these low heart rate zones for periods of time, you probably find that, they're reasonably sufficient when it comes to some of their like lower aerobic capabilities, in which case, looking at adaptations around the heart, but maybe that is something that, doesn't need additional time. But it really depends on the system that they're in. You'll find that in other systems or other combat sports systems where athletes train a lot more high intensity, like they do need a bit more of that injected in a way to balance out their profile. Because inherently the ability, when you look at Zone 2 and you look at some of the cardiac and sort of mitochondrial adaptations from that, like really what you're trying to do is you're trying to help athletes recover. So in a fight sport context, it's your ability to recover between either sequences within rounds or between rounds. And that's very important. But in terms of the importance of it in training, I do think that it comes down to the system and what they do. And then how you do it, it's another question entirely.
That's a good start with Zone 2. Where do I want to take this? So let's go into let's go a little further into that. So you mentioned obviously with the heart adaptations. I don't know if you read Martin Boucher and Paul Larson's, I guess, an opinion paper they released not too long ago on basically bagging Zone 2 for soccer. So
sorry,
basically,
I didn't. Sorry, you cut out for a bit there, James.
The paper from Martin Boucher, Paul Larson, it's an opinion paper they released not too long ago. Basically, I think it was outdated Zone 2 training. It was based on soccer athletes. You still got me there? Nope. Got you back.
Sorry, James. Yeah, cut out.
Yep. You got me. And then
we're back.
They're basically arguing that you get similar adaptations at the heart level with from long and short from long and short high intensity intervals.
Yeah. For soccer players.
Yeah, and this is all about soccer players. So basically, do they need to do a shit ton more volume of Zone 2 when we can do less volume and use long and short high intensity intervals and still get similar adaptations of the heart, just different pathways? What's your thought on that then?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess when it comes to football, I don't understand enough about the sport in terms of the work to passive to active periods.
What about applied to combat sports then?
Yeah, so combat sports, you definitely have, 100% right. You probably, I imagine that you'd see combat sports in terms of activity to passiveness over the period of time to be a lot greater than in football. Would that be correct? Would you say, or
in terms of work to rest?
Work to rest, yeah.
Well, for work to rest, we're looking at 1 to 2 to 1 to 4 in MMA.
Yeah, but correct? I think 1 to 4. Because I've read that paper as well, and I think what it doesn't state is that includes the 1 minute rest. in between rounds,
Interesting.
right? So it's like all of a sudden you're like, oh, that
You
changes
just
things a
skewed the
little bit.
data.
Yeah, no, seriously, like it does change things a little bit, but what you see is that it does change like significantly, dependent on competition level, and then dependent on weight class as well.
Yeah,
But
that
yeah,
is interesting.
yeah, it's a good question, honestly. I think I definitely would put a preference on some of the. We talk about high intensity interval training. We're talking about sort of like long intervals, short intervals.
Yeah, just stick with those for this. Just so it's really basic for
Yeah,
people
I mean
listening.
that
Like you need like
definitely
90 to 120% of maximal aerobic speed or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that's definitely would be a preference for me. I think like when you come back to talking about the training itself of the athletes, I think oftentimes like what you will see is you'll see gaps either at the top or at the bottom. And like I'm very big on, when it comes to what do you need from conditioning, well, essentially you need to align with the physiological needs of sport. You need to align with what you need physiologically as a person, so your personal requirements, and then you need to align with what essentially don't you get when it comes to your sport and sporting practice that you do now. So I think that it's oftentimes the high and the lows that are missed within combat sports. I do think that when it comes to those high intensity interval training, whether or not it's the short or the long intervals, it can be hard to get there, and whether or not it's MMA or striking based sports within some of the specific contexts. And one thing that I've found is that it does vary quite a lot dependent of experience. So you find that people who are more experienced are quite efficient. People who are less experienced are maybe a little bit less efficient. And I do think that does potentially change the way that some of that can be used, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So just move your microphone a little closer to your face, Bill. There. Yeah.
Sorry, the
Perfect.
mic.
And no, you're good. Because you mentioned obviously with specific modalities for those. Then is that your preferred option over, say, jumping on a row machine or air bike or whatever and doing those intervals with prescribed intensities?
Yeah, great question. So I think that when you break down conditioning, you can't, like, we often think about conditioning as, these are the energy systems that we use, and we pull from different parts of different energy systems depending on what task. And that is very true. But we often don't put the same thought into things like efficiency and economy when it comes to the movement itself, or like the sporting movement. So I think that like that in itself, and the prime example of that is my jiu-jitsu coach. He can not train forever and jump in and roll and roll for an hour and be sweet. The old Muay Thai coach who doesn't train can jump in and spar with the guys and be sweet. And it's not because it's not because from a energy system perspective or a metabolic perspective they're able to generate more ATP. Like, they're just extremely efficient within the movements themselves. So I think that like needs to be given credit. So when we talk about zone 2 training, I don't think running is bad at all, even for MMA fighters. I do think running's quite beneficial for striking based sports specifically, but I think especially for MMA there's something to participating in some of those lower intensity work sessions with modalities that are more specific, because potentially we can build efficiency as well as some of the adaptations. That's my thought process around that. I think for some of the high intensity interval training, it's pretty dependent on phase when it comes to like when you do things. I do like the idea of doing them specifically as well, but I do know the limitations for some people to get to the place that they need to, in which case some of the cross-training modalities, whether or not it's running, that's on an airdyne, it's on a rower, become quite beneficial. And I do think a lot of that is probably more beneficial when it comes to the off-camp or off-season than during in-camp.
At what point does efficiency, I'm not going to say not matter, but as say an athlete, let's just take Adesanya for example, one of the more efficient strikers in the UFC. At what point would you be like, hey, maybe we don't need to do these intervals specifically We just need to really target those adaptations to get this, to basically get what we want out of them. So we're going to put you on an Airdyne or roll, whatever it is.
Yeah, I think like it all comes back to, those 3 points before around, like physiological demands. What do you need? And what you need is based on more than the sport. It's based on your competition. It's based on your weight class. There's many factors that go into what's the physiological requirement for the specific person in this context. And then, of course, what do you need specifically? And I think that's why having the ability to test and test well becomes so important, because it gives you the context and understanding to make some of those decisions around when you put some of that in and how much. Because I think the big thing with MMA is it is extremely taxing, and there's a lot that goes into it. So I think, if you look at skill being king, so skill is the most important factor, we need to be very methodical about how we use anything that's non-specific to that. And I think that the rationale needs to be there for it, and the need needs to be there for it. And then depending on how big that need is, then that potentially will depend on the dose that you can use. But I think that without having the understanding of, one, the importance of it, the importance comes from the demand, and then the requirement from the athlete in terms of their testing and how they or where they're at a specific time. I think you need those to be able to dose correctly.
You mentioned some fancy tests last time around energy system stuff. How is that? Maybe give an example of how the conditioning prescription was applied to a certain test result.
Yeah, so like a good example being like, and I think what's important as well is when you start to delve quite deep into this, like, we talked about, say, one of the big tests that we do is the max 60-second assault bike test, where essentially athlete goes as hard as possible for the whole minute, and then they've got 3 to 5 minutes on the back end to recover. It's pretty disgusting.
Yeah, that's brutal.
It's disgusting. So we do it with a combination of NIRS, heart rates. So even though we look at the power, and we look at the power at different points, I'm very interested in how the muscle oxygen kinetics look. I'm very interested in how the heart rate kinetics look, and potentially that informs some of the discrepancies. But to confirm those, like, because really that's you're now making assumptions based on that. Confirm those, I want to look at something that's a bit more specific. So that's when we'll start to look at things like sparring, whether or not it's the heart rates, or it might even be like the NIRS profile in sparring. And then that gives a little bit more context for how some of that prescription might change. And a good example might be that, you do the test, your average power for 60 seconds is good. Maybe your power at the first 30 was, like pretty high. It was above average. Maybe you're below average to the last 30. Maybe your heart rate recovery, the trend is elevated compared to the average. And I think I'm fortunate because I've got reference data that I can look at and be like, okay, you're outside of what we typically see, and that's just enough to spark looking into things a little bit more. And then maybe we see in sparring that the heart rate recovery isn't where we'd want it. So maybe it's the, looking at some of Andrew's work, maybe it's the heart rate, it's, within the first 20 to 30 seconds, maybe that's sort of delayed. Maybe it's the overall heart rate recovery. Potentially that can then inform some of those shifts in terms of the conditioning. And generally, if the heart rate is elevated and the recovery isn't being met, it probably highlights that the aerobic requirements aren't quite being met in terms of the sport.
So what would you then prescribe off the back of that?
So that would be an interesting one, and I guess like that would depend on the time frame. And if you're in a fight camp, you're a little bit more limited.
Yeah.
Potentially, like maybe if you're looking at, say, short intervals, potentially maybe that recovery comes down a little bit to sort of promote that recovery going up. Maybe it's looking at adding in or maybe it's look at reducing some of the rest during one of the skills-based sessions, which is, say, inherently a little bit more low intensity. So then that session becomes just a little bit more aerobic based, almost like zone 2 based. That makes sense. So those are probably like the little things. I wouldn't be just adding stuff in for the sake of it. And if I was, there'd be many factors that would need looking at.
And then so like the opposite profile, someone who maybe doesn't put out good power during the test, but their heart rate recovery looks quite good and their NEARS looks quite good, then you'll be like, okay, we'll increase the rest of most of your stuff and really have you do, like you say, more quote unquote power-based intervals.
Yeah, it definitely could be. It definitely could be. And I think like, some people that are a bit more diesel, that maybe struggle when it comes to getting things going or, instantaneous power, maybe those are the people who need that. And I think like what it often comes down to is, when you start to look at, it's quite complex when you start to look at things from a detailed perspective, because like the other components that come into it are, if you're in a fight camp, who are you fighting? Like, what's the game plan against this person? And then what do you need to get out of the athlete? And where if you had a game plan that was more based around output and based around essentially strike count or repeat sprintability,
like volume of work,
then you might not want to do that. So it's definitely all quite dependent on the circumstance.
So someone like, just take for example like Nate Diaz, a huge volume puncher. For someone a profile like that, he's just like he runs triathlons, basically does all the slow stuff. In that instance, then would you be looking? I mean, this is completely hypothetical, theoretical, so it's impossible to say, but just a generalization. Like with that profile, then because of the way he fights, that power-based stuff, you might do a little bit of it, but it wouldn't be a priority to be like, hey, we need to bring up your striking power. Blah. It's like your game's a volume punching game. We're gonna lean into it.
Possibly. I think for someone like that who's so far on that side of the spectrum, he might be a guy that I would put more emphasis on trying to dial up the power with more recovery. Because I think that in terms of, I guess when you think about, all the different buckets in terms of performance, you could probably assume that bucket would be quite low. So perhaps we can get something out of it faster.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it would still play it. Like that still would play into it. And then you'd have to assess the cost when it comes to any of the, are you going to compromise any of the aerobic qualities for that? I think when it comes to combat, when it comes to any sports, any adaptations you drive, you're taking something from somewhere else. I think you need to understand, if you don't understand that, you end up being surprised by things. So I think it's important. And that's why when it comes to testing and monitoring standpoint, I think having good versatility within that helps you understand if you pull from something, how's it affecting something else? And to be honest, we'll never understand that as well as we probably want to, but I think it's extremely important.
Nice. I want to come back to the power stuff that we talked about near the beginning. Kind of all links together anyway. But I think you mentioned for some of your power-based tests or jump tests, I think you do an unloaded and a loaded jump. And there's a different schools of thought around developing power, peak power. I'll be interested to hear yours. And since you do a loaded jump, I'm going to assume you're on the quote unquote surf the curve kind of style training. But obviously, there's people that will be like, okay, we're just going to train super heavy on the force end. Because if you train in the middle, it's not fast enough, or it's not hit, like there's not enough force. Or we're trying to train just on the velocity end as well, because then we get the super speed. We train either end, and they come together and they create this magical peak power number at the end. Because you train both ends. I guess what's your philosophy and take on training through that spectrum of loads for maximizing power for combat sports? Is it the same for all combat sports? Is it different based on the different kinds? I'll let you run with it.
I think really good question. I think what's really important, and I think this is probably what I consider the most, and I think a lot of people listening probably work between different competition level athletes. Development level is really important when it comes to answering that question. I think that if you are an athlete who is developed, as in I'm training competition level, still moving through, side of things is probably the being on the force end is probably going to be more initially. You need to do both, and they change as you get closer to competition. I think the development level is really important for where we start to changes. One is the sport. Like obviously, MMA is a significantly higher force requirement than say boxing, right? So like you can definitely argue that you want to spend more time, like not just at the top of that, like prioritizing force, but you probably want to spend more time in those middle zones. Well, because a lot of them are quite sport specific. Definitely spend more time in MMA. The curve. Like, there's a study that looked at. You might have seen this one. National boxing team in Brazil, I think. Essentially, they trained the that corresponded with
optimal peak power, right?
Yeah, and it was quite interesting. Like they had some pretty let's be honest, the programming was pretty basic. Some nice changes.
Like 6x6 jumps for like 6 weeks or something like that.
I think it was 4x6 or something like that.
Okay, yeah.
They did like a bench throw and a jump squat or something like that. What was like interesting is they had within that cohort the gold medalist, and this happened after, and an Olympic bronze medalist. And when they looked at essentially what was the difference, the Olympic gold medalist produced like 49.4% more power, optimal power load, than just the general cohort of Olympic-based athletes. It was quite interesting. I think that probably highlights on itself that, spending time other than just high or low is quite valuable. And this is boxing. There's a significantly lower force requirement than MMA.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you on that as well. I tend to go through, and as you mentioned, I see it as striking kind of more on the velocity and MMA in the middle, and grappling more on the force end. And you can kind of skew your programming either way, depending on the sport. Regarding the optimal power load, is that something you'd like to use within your training? Do you think that should be emphasized as a way to develop power, or is it more of the fact that, hey, we just need to we need to shift the numbers through the entire range? It doesn't matter if we try and pinpoint where this optimal peak power load is.
Personally, use optimal peak power load. I do use my velocity based loading though quite a lot. And that does change depending on the phase and the targets. But I think when you go back to that prior point around, what do the best athletes do better? They apply force faster. I think that probably highlights that even within the lifting context, if you can, apply force with less time, that's probably going to be beneficial. So we do spend a lot of time working maximal loading and try to move it fast. We're just going to go with it.
No, perfect. That answers the question. And to finish this off as well, because we're coming to the hour, eccentric training blocks. Is that something because you obviously talked a lot about muscle architecture and flexibility. Is that something then that you're trying to bring into training? Let's just say out of camp because you got some time to work with. Is that something you're trying to bring into training as soon as possible? Trying to get them ready for that super maximal loading to be able to drive those adaptations, high forces, high velocities, etc.
Training is very potent stimulus. I think like with a lot of that, sort of man, and with great power comes great responsibility. Like, and it's really true when it comes to the eccentrics because you can really fuck people up with them.
Oh yeah,
and whether or not it's performance substantially, not it's compromising them technically, just in general, whether or not they're getting injured. So I think like eccentric training, we use it a lot. Like it's so important. And we talked about the architectural changes in fascicle length with the long ISOs. It's like eccentric training has like a lot of very like there's a lot more evidence supporting those changes as a result of those training modalities. So we definitely use them like together. I definitely would use them in the off camp quite a bit. You've got to build into them. So I wouldn't use them in the first spot. I would generally say if a fighter has a fight, the week off, they get back into the gym. Probably the first 3 to 4 weeks, there's no eccentric training. Xbox is where we might start to filter them in, but even then, I would be aware of the dose. And when it comes to the type, that I would look at as well. I think the overload stuff's fantastic. Eccentrics are fantastic. When you look at striking research, what is striking, and you've got high velocities, you've got high forces, and that's exactly what you get out of fast eccentric training. I think using the ability to use that modality well go a long way and is very potent when you get it right.
I know you have a flywheel there, so let's ignore the flywheel, and let's say someone's listening to this and want to implement the eccentric training. Obviously, most fighters with low training ages, I'm throwing a bar with 110% 1RM on their back to do squats is challenging. So what are you doing then for exercise selection for some of these eccentrics?
So, if depending on like the ones that I use the most around the board are probably things like your altitude drops.
Mm-hmm. Is that landing with not with stiff legs, then you're just dropping and you're landing into a squat position?
But positionally, you're probably at like a quarter squat position generally.
Gotcha.
Where I do it. I've done them as well with heels off the ground. So you're dropping to just eyeballs of feet. So you've got to remember that the structure here for fighters is very important.
You could drop into like a split stance position too, right?
100%. As well as that, like doing things from like a push position is quite valuable as well. I know there's some research coming out. It was one of our guys, John Wilson, who put me onto it with like a reactive plyometric push-up for
Lee
boxers.
Brown's
Yeah.
I
saw something.
I just had him on the pod.
I'll have to listen to it because and I'd love to talk to him actually because that to me sounds awesome. And it's I think that when you highlight like stiffness being important on impact of punch, probably something that we can get out of eccentric training. But then how we do it is the question. And then you can also do it manually with athletes as well, which potentially you can get some more specific type work with.
Yeah, that reactive push-up one's interesting because when I think about doing, say, a drop jump and then a drop push-up, similar thing. I like to think about it as like as fast as you can ground contact time and get back to whatever the elevated surface is. So it's like minimal elbow bend, whereas a lot of the stuff you see online, it's not truly plyometric, right? Because they're dropping off these things and they're going all the way down chest to the floor and they're pushing back up onto it, and you go, are you getting out of that what you want to get out of it versus that really quick ground contact with hands? I did it and I was like, damn, this hurts. Just hitting the ground and coming back up. So that's the only tough thing about it.
Well, because I think that what's interesting, because we talked a bit about the testing protocols. Mainline press is one that we've used and we do use, but it doesn't necessarily have the ability to differentiate between not just competition levels, but good punches. It was kind of got me thinking well, a mechanistic standpoint, there's something that's happening here that translating back to the sport. In which case, I think did we talk about it last time? I remember that got me thinking initially. And then, there was this Conor McGregor video where he's talking about how you need to disconnect the shoulders and then reconnect them on impact. Was a really cool account, and it kind of makes you think about the towel whip, an effective punch standpoint. When you think about a landmine, it's just very grunty all the way through, right?
It is.
So that made me think about, maybe that relaxation piece is quite important. And then there's a paper by Stuart McGill that looks at I forget what it's called. It's like a double
peak muscle activation one.
There's there's a peak and then there's a relaxation. There's another peak again, which essentially that almost is what Conor McGregor is talking about. So it's
you lose that with the landmine punch and
You
and
do.
things like that.
I really think you do. And like, as a result, like I don't really use the landmine punch anymore. I I still use landmine variations. I think the landmine's a great tool. I think that I'm aware of that. What I would like is if a body test is able to reflect what we're seeing in competition, probably worth something. That's something I'm interested in looking at.
Yeah, that plyometric push, that'll be. I don't know if I don't think they've published that yet. I'll have to. I'll link you guys up, and I'm sure he's got plenty of stuff there. But Bill, we're running out of time here. Where can people follow you? I mean, they should have followed you already from the first podcast, but if they haven't, where can they follow you?
Share that. I use social media a whole heap, but Instagram is good. Smarter_performance.
Sweet.
Flick me a follow, and if you have any questions around any of this stuff, flick me a message.
Perfect. I'll link that up in the description too. I appreciate you coming on, Bill, for round 2. We're going to have to do round 3 at some point too. We're just scratching the surface on stuff, man. These are good chats.
So much. So much.
If you guys have questions for us, just shoot them through. Maybe I'll send out an email and see. And then if there's questions, we can just jump on and answer some of the questions and whatnot. See what happens.